The courtroom was packed, but it felt cold. Darius Cole stood at the defendant's table in a navy blue suit that didn't quite fit. Wrinkles at the sleeves. Collar too tight. Hands shaking just enough to notice. But he stood tall. Because this wasn't just another hearing. This was the day they'd decide if he'd spend the next 15 years in prison. For something he didn't do. They said he robbed a gas station. That he fit the description. That his prints were on the door. What they didn't say. That Darius was at work. Clocked in at a warehouse 14 miles away. That his supervisor could vouch for him. That the camera footage from the gas station was blurry. And the man in it was 3 inches shorter. But none of that seemed to matter. Because Darius was young. He was black. And he had already been arrested. He glanced over at the prosecutor's table. A sharp man in a suit worth more than Darius made in 3 months. He smiled like this was easy. Like justice had already made up its mind. The judge tapped the bench. Let's proceed. And just like that, it began. The prosecution spoke first. They laid out a story like it was a movie script. They showed a grainy still image. They read out old juvenile records. They repeated prior contact with law enforcement. Like it was a personality trait. And when they said Darius had a violent aura, some in the jury nodded, even though no violence had occurred. Not in the footage, not in the arrest, just in the assumption. Darius's public defender stood, a young woman named Alyssa Raymond, overworked, underpaid, but determined. She showed the time card, called the warehouse manager, played the security cam that showed Darius loading boxes, at the exact moment of the so-called robbery. But the judge barely looked up. When she brought up the height difference, he waved it off. When she mentioned racial profiling, he raised an eyebrow. And when she said, "This young man is on trial for his skin, not his actions," the courtroom laughed, including the judge. Darius stared at the floor, his knuckles white. His mother in the back row silently cried, a tissue clutched in one hand, and a Bible in the other. They thought it was over, that the story was done. But then something happened, something no one expected. It was just afternoon when the courtroom doors creaked open. Most people didn't notice at first. A few heads turned. But then the silence came. The kind of silence that feels heavy. Like the room suddenly knows something is about to shift. And then, he walked in. A tall black man in a crisp gray suit. Briefcase in one hand, badge on his belt. Eyes sharp, steps slow and deliberate. He didn't sit with the audience. He walked straight to the defense table and whispered something to Alyssa. Her eyes widened. Darius turned to look, confused. The judge leaned forward. "Excuse me, who are you?" The man turned calmly. "Detective Marcus Vale. I'm with Internal Affairs, Metro PD. I have evidence that was never disclosed to the defense." The entire room stiffened. The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Internal Affairs has no standing in this case." But the judge, suddenly less confident, asked, "What kind of evidence?" Vale opened his briefcase, pulled out a DVD, a printed report, photos, receipts, and then he dropped the bomb. The actual suspect in the gas station robbery was arrested last week. He confessed. Matched fingerprints. Same build, same hoodie, same shoes. And he admitted that Darius Cole had nothing to do with it. You could hear someone gasp in the gallery. Vale continued. But the confession wasn't entered into this case file. It was buried. The detective who made the original arrest is under investigation for multiple civil rights violations, including false identifications in minority neighborhoods. This young man, he pointed at Darius, was about to be sent to prison for a crime that was already solved. The judge sat back, stunned. For the first time in that courtroom, nobody spoke. Not the jury, not the prosecutor, not the clerk, just the hum of the lights, and the sound of a man's innocence rising from beneath the dirt they tried to bury it under. Darius looked over at his mom. She was frozen, hands over her mouth. Tears streamed down her face. But this time they weren't from fear. Alyssa looked at the judge. "Your Honor, I motion for immediate dismissal of all charges." The prosecutor tried to speak, but the judge cut him off. "Granted. Mr. Cole, you are free to go." Those words didn't feel real. Not at first. Darius stood, hands trembling. He looked down at the table, then up at Alyssa, then at the judge, then slowly, like he was afraid the moment would vanish. He stepped out from behind the table and walked away from the chains. They had nearly wrapped around him for life. The courtroom didn't erupt into cheers. It just sat in silence, as if no one wanted to admit what they had almost allowed to happen. Outside, cameras had already gathered. Reporters shouted questions. How do you feel, Darius? What would you say to the system right now? Are you going to sue? But Darius didn't stop. He walked straight into his mother's arms. And there, in front of the courthouse that almost swallowed him, he cried like a child. Not because he was weak, but because he survived. He stood alone while they looked away. But when the truth walked in, they had no choice but to look back. They thought it would end in the courtroom. A dismissal. A quiet, you're free to go. No apology. No headlines. No consequences. But Darius Cole didn't leave quietly. He walked out those courthouse doors with more than a cleared name. He walked out with a voice. And he was going to use it. That night, the local news gave it 42 seconds. Charges dismissed in mistaken identity case. No name. No mention of internal affairs. No mention of the other man who confessed. Just another blip in a city that preferred its shame and silence. But the neighborhood knew, and they weren't about to let it go. 2 days later, a video appeared online. A grainy cell phone clip of Darius's mother, speaking through tears outside the courthouse steps. They were going to lock my baby up for 15 years. And he was at work. He was at work, y'all. It hit 1 million views in 3 hours. By the next morning, the story was viral. People started asking questions. Why weren't the charges dropped earlier? Why wasn't the confession part of the original case file? Why is the arresting officer still on active duty? And when the city didn't answer, the people answered for them. Protests began. Not massive at first, but loud, clear, placards that read, "It could have been me." 15 years for nothing. They wouldn't even say sorry. And then one sign stood out, held by a little girl sitting on her father's shoulders. He worked while they slept on the truth. Darius didn't plan to speak. At first, he didn't even want to. He had spent 3 months in pretrial detention, away from his job, his family, his future. He wanted peace. But peace wasn't what knocked on his door. Justice did. A local youth group invited him to speak. Then a university. Then National News Network. And when Darius finally spoke into a microphone, his voice cracked, but it didn't waver. You can take everything from a man. His freedom, his name, his time. But when he gets his voice back, you better listen. And they did. The clip aired on national TV. It wasn't just a soundbite. It was a siren. Because Darius wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for the thousands who never got their moment, who never had Detective Vale walk into their courtroom, who disappeared behind concrete walls and case files because they didn't get a second chance. The city tried to play catch-up. Suddenly, police department was reviewing internal policies. The mayor released a generic statement. We take these matters seriously and will continue to strive for fairness. But no names were named. No one was fired. No charges were filed. They hoped time would do the erasing. But Darius had other plans. He partnered with a civil rights foundation, started an initiative called Wrong Side of the Bench, an advocacy project aimed at reviewing wrongful arrests in the area. He showed up at council meetings. He rallied students. He sat across from lawmakers and told his story, again and again. Each time, it got harder. But each time, he looked them in the eye and said, I'm not the only one. I'm just the one who got out. The same courthouse that laughed at his defense now had his face on a mural, painted by local artists. Not because he won, but because he endured. They tried to hide it, but he spoke louder. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with the quiet power of a man who had once been silenced and now had nothing to lose. A letter arrived by courier. No warning, no phone call, just a white envelope on the porch, stamped with the city's seal. Darius held it in his hands like it might burn him. Inside, a formal apology and an offer. $300,000. No court case. No public hearing. Just a check and a promise that the city regrets the inconvenience caused. Inconvenience. They tried to bury his life. They paraded him in cuffs, stole months from his youth, left his mother sobbing in court while strangers laughed in her face. Now, they were calling it an inconvenience. His lawyer, Alyssa, sat across the kitchen table, quietly reading the letter again. It's hush money, she said finally. You take it. They don't have to admit fault. You sue. You'll be waiting years. You might lose. But if you win, it'll mean something. Darius looked down at the paper again. He didn't need the money. He needed his dignity back. That night, he went to the roof of his apartment. Same place he had stood the night he was released. Same skyline, same city. But everything looked different now. He closed his eyes and thought of every brother sitting in a cell for something they didn't do. Every courtroom that whispered guilty before hearing the facts. Every mother who couldn't hug her son after trial. Could he really take this check and walk away? The next morning, he called the city attorney's office. When the secretary answered, he spoke clearly. Tell them I won't sign anything unless they do it on a record. In court, in front of a judge, with reporters watching. And I want the arresting officer named, not hidden in a footnote. And I want them to publicly clear my name. Say it, out loud, the same way they accused me. They were stunned. Nobody had said no before. Most people took the money. But Darius didn't want a check. He wanted a change. So the city lawyer responded with silence, then with pushback, then with fear, because the pressure wasn't dying down. People were marching every weekend now. More stories were coming out. Others wrongfully accused, wrongfully jailed. The city was bleeding truth at the seams. They had no choice. 2 weeks later, the courtroom was full again. But this time, Darius wasn't the defendant. He stood at the front in a dark blazer, no cuffs, no guards. The same judge who once rolled his eyes now cleared his throat nervously. And the city's legal counsel read a prepared statement. Mr. Cole was wrongfully accused. We acknowledge our failure to review evidence in a timely manner. We regret the pain caused to Mr. Cole and his family. The city has initiated internal reforms. But Darius didn't hear the rest. He looked out across the room, at the faces of strangers, supporters, young men who looked like him. And when the statement ended, he stepped up to the microphone. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. He just told the truth. You offer me money, but that wouldn't fix the system. That wouldn't stop it from happening again. I don't want a settlement. I want a standard. I want the next young man who's accused to be presumed innocent. I want the next mother in that courtroom to feel hope, not fear. I want every officer who abuses power to be held accountable, no matter the badge. He paused. You gave me back my freedom, but I had to fight for my name. Now I'm fighting for the names you haven't heard yet. The courtroom was still, but no one was laughing now, because the young man they once tried to erase had become the voice they couldn't ignore. They tried to close the book, to call it a rare mistake, an unfortunate error, a one-time failure in an otherwise just system. But what happened to Darius Cole wasn't rare. It wasn't new, and it sure wasn't quiet, because when his story hit national news, it hit different. A young black man, falsely accused, nearly jailed for 15 years. And the only thing that saved him? A detective who couldn't sleep with the lie anymore. That didn't sound like a fluke. It sounded like a mirror, one that forced America to take a long look at the cracks in its reflection. Universities invited him to speak. He showed up, not as a victim, but as a witness to the pattern. This system isn't broken, he said at Howard University. It was built this way, and now it's doing exactly what it was designed to do. Silence us, cage us, erase us. His words didn't echo in empty halls. They lit fires. Criminal justice students quoted him. Professors played his case video in lectures. Activists used his story as Exhibit A. Local councils introduced legislation to make internal case reviews mandatory. And in the back corners of the internet, the kind where headlines usually fade fast, his clips stayed pinned. But Darius wasn't done. He returned to the jail he was held in for 3 months, this time as a guest. Not of the system, but of the men still caught inside it. He sat across from them, told them the truth. I walked out, but you're still here. So I won't stop talking until somebody opens the door for you too. One man, inside for over a year waiting trial, asked, How do you sleep at night? Darius replied, I don't. Not really. Not while they're still sleeping on our lives. Soon after, he started a nonprofit. Second name, a group dedicated to exposing wrongful arrests and racial bias in policing. Their motto? Because being innocent isn't enough anymore. Local governments weren't thrilled. Some called him divisive. A few tried to discredit him. But they were too late, because his name, once buried in a court docket, was now a movement. A documentary filmmaker reached out. The story went global. European networks covered it. Panels discussed it. Celebrities tweeted it. And for the first time in years, Darius's phone didn't ring with threats or debt collectors. It rang with hope. A senator asked him to testify before Congress. He wore the same suit he wore to his dismissal hearing. Still fit, still sharp, but now it carried history on its shoulders. He stood behind the mic, looked into the faces of power, and said, "This country taught me how to survive accusation. Now I'm here to teach it how to prevent them." I wasn't the problem. The system that needed me to be guilty was. A pause, a breath, and then, the next Darius Cole may not get a detective. He may not get a courtroom that listens. So I need you to build a country that doesn't need luck to deliver justice. The room was silent, but outside, the story had already reached millions. Young people, old activists, mothers, judges, former inmates, and maybe, just maybe, future lawmakers. Darius Cole never wanted to be a symbol. He just wanted to go to work, live his life, make his mom proud. But when the system tried to write him off as another statistic, he became the headline they couldn't control. This wasn't just a courtroom victory. It was a message carved into the steel walls of American justice. A reminder, a warning, and most of all, a wake-up call.